Hello, and welcome to the setup video for the Buzz Space Models 1. Make sure you apply a little bit of speed. Next, take the first side core and place it onto the stand, while guiding the brass rod through the center engine. Both the side cores and the SpaceX logo, fully place it in between the side cores. The SpaceX logo needs to stay flexible until the main struts are attached. And just be sure that they are pushed in as far as they can go. Now take the first main upper strut part and apply superglue to all 3 notches. These need to go into the holes on all cores. Make sure the hydraulic actuators on the strut are facing upwards. You may need to wiggle the cores around in order to make it fit properly. That's why you are not supposed to use the lower struts. A towel between the rocket and the table, also 2 places. Before you apply the struts, stand while the glue fully dries. Lastly, put
rock solid, having a real 40 degrees per second this time. Now on this recent flight you can tell the footage as the ref. A lot of these improve off. You can actually see it in the flight footage. That little white piece floating away is a bit of the right core that should not have detached. As I ejected the first motor, it started to heat up the motor tube that they were both mounted in. The tube is 3D printed and it's mounted, but it didn't show because of a gear pointed through this little A.
The Form 2 is the most used professional 3D printer in the industry.
The velocity of the rocket, much what I've explained here is instead of repairing to produce a perpendicular force right at the bottom, the rocket full, freedom to control itself because the elastic would always pull it to the side if it started drifting or something like that. So I can never really get it to properly hover.
Models. Or is this strictly just for, just personal use? I want viewers to know, and I had it hanging on my shelf,
leading up to this, which sensor, it has a little cost and how quick it came down, continue pushing forward. Like all of that is with a locking into some air, keep the rocket upright. Fundamentally, it points it in different directions, and that's right here. Results here. Just because every time there's a chance that something that I feel the BPS program has, I intend to take it further. But I think making a lot of these when I would love to much money on space travel. I feel great. That's going to be some really necessary for the 40 plus times at this point. It doesn't matter that it's all really rehearsed. The BPS program has. I intend to take it further. I'm gonna try my best to just write it. As a kid, my dad and I would go out to a field with a couple of little model rockets and shoot them off, but I didn't get really serious about it until 3 years ago. My name is Joe Barnard. I'm an amateur rocketeer. I'm not sure if amateur is the right word to use for that, because at this point they're pretty advanced. That's what I want to change. Like, excellent. The things, all of these computers that you don't want to, space launch companies that are just trying to get, we're gonna drop the doing these launches. How I improve is one of the hardest things. I haven't been able to land a model rocket yet, right? But I'm getting really close. Just in the last few months, I've started actually conducting these landing tests. We're gonna drop the rocket from a drone, and we're gonna simulate the second half of flight without needing to also launch it. One of the hardest things about doing these launches, this is a total cameras. Cool. Cool. What we can see, like right off the bat, is that the rocket came down and burned the motor a little bit too late. As it comes down, it's really at an angle here. Even though it starts to really correct here, it's too late. It's still moving pretty fast at that point. And I'll have to update that in the... Just the problem with that is if you pour so much engineering time and effort into one of these things and you make... I'll reload a motor and, you know, the internet be so that we can effectively keep the rocket upright. Fundamentally, an Atlas V inspector controls up into space. The motor and points it in different directions down through a new than we did in the 60s that I've rehearsed. It's all taken away from the rocket. Ooh! It landed on the legs! Whew, that was cool, man. I feel great. That's going to be some really solid data. A couple of other people have done thrust vectoring before, but certainly no one has come as far as the BPS program has. I intend to take it further. But I think making a lot of these advancements at the small scale, I think there's like where I am now.
Yeah, it smells really, really burnt out right
Emirates has partnered with GE to pioneer industry-first digital solutions to optimize the operations of Emirates engineering. Sensors fitted to the engines of Emirates Boeing 777 aircraft collect a wealth of
That's one. launch sequence.
On the launch pad, all the preparation.
You see flames
Fuel.
Inside the spacecraft. But
and that upper stage has its own thrusters.
But the fire is of the but that
escapes
personnel in seconds.
From somebody difficult to see those flames, you must
flames in craft until their capsule emerges from the fireball.
It gets them out of the way, but only with 2 seconds to spare. It's just like in the movies.
When Alexei Leonov made the world ground control, Leonov made the decision to slowly vent air from his suit. In space, danger was far from any spark of temperature and humidity would land. They made 86 kilometers over Moscow's Red Square. Leonov joked to Belyayev, "We could land there if you want," before the craft flew further north and finally landed at 9:02 GMT on March the 19th in the thick, snowy forests of the operated in 1966. Then please visit our Patreon page.
One.
During launch, the spacecraft would be wires that ran down the entire.
At the booster, we would just.
Another, a little Joe, was to be used to test the launch.
Fire the device. Little mistake arose, and the vehicle started to roll. The escape rocket. When it broke the link on the. When it broke the link on the flight escape system.
Ironically, the unanticipated failure of the Little Joe rocket provided the best
recorder because they were using language. It and to be a very impressive. The rocket did. Okay, so at this to say initiate the tape recorder system and system have a launch escape tower on the top. And given that the mission went so catastrophically wrong, one wonders how they intended for the crew to escape. Well, as it turns out, SpaceX has their own answer. And coincidentally, one of the first tests of the system, a launch pad abort, is going to happen this week on the 6th, so we're going to be all watching that for great boom boom and explosion.
Come on up. Get more. More.
Máng ngon lắm.
Niin koitum, senäget saa. Riona mana.
its delta V. Kerbal Space Program, as well as the overall delta V, the stage and the information panels will retract back to normal. Scroll up and down will adjust automatically whenever relevant parts are added or removed. The body and even the atmospheric circumstance are tweakable, whether it's in a vacuum, a specific altitude, or a launch at sea level, including the thrust-to-weight ratio, the combined specific impulse, and more. In flight mode, the amount of delta V of each stage and the overall amount of delta V is automatically updated as the
Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and you're looking at that you can actually create a much cheaper rocket if you start making this as a ship in a harbor that already sort of exists. So just like we would make a submarine electrolyzer full of nuclear and thus align it vertically, and we're going to see how this works. A large enough making the see the aircraft carrier that was supposed to vertically, oh here, no launch. And the way that's hold the rocket, which would then lifts into space. And as you can see, these engines here were basically used for maneuvering and positioning. And so this is kind of how all of this works. And then once the first stage runs out of fuel, which will happen anytime now actually, this engine will be released. It sort of has its own system of delivery. It's really just a dumb booster meant to deliver an actual rocket that would be hidden here. And interestingly, this was actually one of the first times that reusable rockets were even sort of in and it was unfortunate this rocket, or the second biggest, larger, but since it's not developed just yet and we don't really know the exact specific
Ich hab den Job! Ja!
Jobware, die Jobbörse an deiner Seite. Jetzt auf jobware.de Job suchen und mit wenigen Klicks bewerben.
Jobware, da hab ich den Job her.
Hello and welcome to this mission, which I am very excited to show you guys today. It is constructing a space station using an SSTO, which admittedly is not the most original idea, but as you can see there's the modules we're going to be putting up there, and there's the fuel truck, because what makes this different, I think, to the other SSTO built space station videos is the fact that we're only using the one SSTO, and it's going to be a constant mission, as in I'm not going to be recovering the flight, I'm not going to be using the spaceplane hangar at all. Everything is going to be done, you know, live, as it were. What I mean by this is that once we've delivered our first payload into orbit, we're going to be flying the SSTO back to the runway, then a truck will come and fill it up with fuel, and another little car will go and push the next payload into it, before taking off again and then coming back and getting the next payload and sending it off once more. So while the actual design of the station modules and the station itself might not be the most impressive things, I think I kind of wanted to showcase this more from an actual mission standpoint and the way this is built, because this is something I've wanted to do for a little while and I never really got round to doing it, so, you know, this is that. I've also never designed a cargo SSTO before, not like a proper one. I did do one in my collaboration station video, but that really couldn't carry very much to orbit. It was basically built to be a long range thing that had sort of a small cargo capacity inside it. Now, I didn't mean to crash this car here, but that will buff out, don't worry about it. I actually parked it here just so we could have something to target to mark the end of the runway when we come in to land this plane, because unfortunately you can't target buildings in Kerbal Space Program yet. I don't know why, but you can't. And we want to really be aiming to undershoot the runway. We need the entire length of the runway for this orange tank payload because it is the heaviest payload by far. The other ones are over 10 tons lighter, so we really need the entire length of the runway in order to get airborne. The subsequent flights won't need the full length of the runway, but it will need as much runway as we can possibly get. So and because of the fact this thing can't taxi and I didn't design any tugs for it, we want to be landing in a position where we're as far back as possible in order to get as much, you know, speed as possible before taking off. I hope that makes sense. It will hopefully make sense once you see it. So at the moment we're currently pitching up at around 20 degrees, which is a fairly conservative pitch. The other flights that we're going to be doing in this video will be able to be a little bit more aggressive during our flight, but as I mentioned, the orange tank is by far the heaviest payload. That's the main reason I'm sending this off first, not only because of the whole runway issue I mentioned, but also because of the fact that because it's the heaviest payload by far, we're going to have a lot less delta V to work with when we actually get into orbit. So if we had to rendezvous with another station part, it would be very tight in terms of the numbers. So it would be it makes a lot more sense. It's far easier to put the heavy bits in first and then getting lighter and lighter as you go on. One of the nice things about this aircraft is that we can build up a pretty impressive amount of speed. Look, 1500 meters per second just then. We are dropping a bit now. But yeah, over the sort of previous updates and things, heating has been buffed a little bit, so we can get to quite a bit of speed, and we want to be getting as fast as possible on the air breathing mode alone, because the closed cycle mode of the Rapiers is not very efficient. But here we are, gradually approaching our apoapsis, so we may as well pitch up nice and aggressively and fire up the closed cycle mode, because now we just want to get out of the atmosphere. So I did start watching the thing here and I realised that I'd forgotten to disable the fuel flow for the orange tank, because the orange tank is actually being draining some of its fuel, so I quickly disabled that. Don't worry, we will be depositing it full. We'll just pump some of the fuel from the SSTO back into the orange tank. But I think in a way that was actually that worked out quite well, because it meant the aircraft was quite balanced. If the orange tank wasn't used, then this would have ended up becoming quite front heavy and may not have been quite as easy to pitch up. Here we go, we'll just pump some of the fuel back in. I guess we could just skip through a lot of that process. There we go. So don't worry, we will be putting the full orange tank in orbit, and we still have a pretty generous amount of delta V left. Obviously we're going to be spending about 400 meters per second to circularize, but we still have a load of oxidizer left over after that maneuver too. We'll tweak our orbit a little bit. You don't really need to see me doing that, because it was a bit of a long process, but I ended up getting an orbit of roughly 90,000 meters, which is nice and high up, but it's not so high that it'll be difficult for us to, you know, get that high. And there's a nice little beauty shot of the cargo doors closing again. All looking nice there, and then we'll just focus on deorbiting ourselves once again. So some of you might be wondering how this thing is getting power, because it's not really running out of electric charge, even though there's no visible solar panels. The reason is, some of the eagle-eyed among you may have already seen this, but inside the cargo bay that's where the probe core is that's controlling it. There's an SAS wheel, as well as some batteries and some RTGs that are generating power for it. Now we are going to overshoot the KSP here by the looks of things. That's it there, we're passing over it right now. We're sort of underneath those clouds here on that little peninsula, so we're going to have to do some rather aggressive banking of the plane. Then we're going to have to swoop down and pass by on the right hand side and swing around again. This way we can make sure we're all landed at the back of the runway, which is where we want to be, to get enough speed up so we can get our next descent on the go. Now, as you can see at the moment, we currently have that crashed rover set as our target. This just helps us line up with the runway, because it's not always easy to reliably line yourself up by eyeballing it. So here we go, swinging down, keeping our speed nice and low. We're going to deliberately undershoot, just so hopefully we roll up that little ridge, bleeding off just enough speed so that we end up, I didn't do a particularly good job here, but we can bleed off some of our speed by going up that small hill, and we've ended up pretty far back. So this, it could have been a lot worse, and we can just time warp just to get ourselves pointed in the right direction. Physical time warp just makes SSTOs easier to spin around on the spot. And we can begin our next stage. So in order to get the ramp to touch the ground, we do need to retract the front landing gear, and we can just reduce the deploy limit a little bit to make this a little bit easier to load cargo onto. We still need those aero spikes on those cars, just so they can build up enough speed and acceleration and just general pushing power to get the cargo up the ramp. But we only need a little bit of fuel expenditure to actually do that. So again, just time warping here to get to the actual loading itself, just being very careful to load this on, firing up that engine sparingly, but you know, just enough to get it on. And there we go, all docked. Now obviously the craft has a very, very small amount of oxidizer and liquid fuel, so as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be having to refuel it, and we're not going to be doing that using an ISRU, even though we've just loaded one on. You can see I accidentally capsized the rover, but using the weird collision quirk that the physics engine has, we can use those side wheels just to help flip itself back up. We can go and park this somewhere. We don't need to destroy it, there's no need, you know. I'm a peace-loving person. Again, you don't really need to watch the entire drive. We'll just swing it around to this building here and park it up in the car park. Anyway, like I was saying, we could refuel this using the ISRU that we just loaded up, but instead we're going to do it properly. We have this fuel tank that I've constructed here. Obviously, we have 2 of these fuel tank trailers, just because we're going to be refueling this thing again to get the final module up. But for now, we're going to drive forwards. We needed a lot of wheels here just to provide enough support without braking, and also to provide enough driving power to actually get there. Our electric charge is driving quite rapidly. We do have solar panels and RTGs, so we can recharge ourselves intermittently, but other than that, there's not really a lot else to it other than just, you know, reversing around and then backing it up until we got our encounter. And here we go, just with the camera zoomed right in. I had to zoom quite far in to get the alignment right, but I knew these things would be the right height anyway. And there we go. So it was quite a long process in order to transfer all the fuel over manually, because regrettably the SSTO has quite a lot of fuel tanks on it, so we can just skip through most of the actual fuel pumping itself. But here's just me selecting the tanks just to demonstrate to you how it worked. But like I say, you don't need to see the whole thing. Long and short of it is, we can undock that truck trailer and drive this thing away, out of the way of the plane. So this thing doesn't have the best turning circle, but you know, it works.
Das ist auch etwas, was zur Kerbholz Gründungsgeschichte gehört. Dieses Gefühl der Selbstermächtigung, dieses Gefühl, dass wir machen das jetzt einfach. Was uns 3 besonders glücklich macht, ist, dass jetzt da etwas steht, wo vorher nichts stand.
It'd be nice if maybe I could have incorporated some sort of stock hinge for the actual joint between the truck and the trailer, but again, it didn't really matter too much. I mean, this has steering on all the wheels, so it wasn't too much of an issue. And then we can just undock the trailer and get ourselves ready to dock onto the next one, but we can do that later, because for now I think we're ready to launch the SSTO once again. So there we go, closing up the front end of the cargo bay. Just having a look at the map view here, I'm going to start launching it. You can see the space station there, so we're just over the desert at the moment, so this is about as good a time as any to actually launch the SSTO once again. So there we go, firing up the rapiers there. We have the station set as our target, And you can see this time we don't even need to get to the end of the runway to get ourselves airborne, and this isn't even the lightest module, so by the time we get to the third module we don't really need much runway space in order to get ourselves off the ground. But as you can see, we are able to pitch up much more aggressively than before, almost sort of 35 degrees as opposed to the less than 20 degrees I was pitching up at before, because we have a lot more power to weight in terms of what we have this time around. So it's much easier and more forgiving to fly. So if you're not the greatest SSTO pilot and would like to get better, then perhaps skip over the actual orange tank payload and just use the lighter ones for now, because they're far more easy to fly and is a lot more forgiving. So we're getting really high up into the atmosphere now, so this is as good a time as any to fire up the closed cycle mode of the rapiers and get our orbit nice and high. Now you can see my encounter isn't the greatest, so I continued to burn to get the markers close together, and I just played around with maneuvered until I got a desirable encounter. So we haven't actually circularized at this point, so we're not going to be getting anywhere close, but it's good to at least somewhat plan ahead. So our separation's still quite fairly far apart, but I guess you can just see how I'm playing around with maneuver nodes. We can skip ahead to the actual encounter itself. So yeah, just doing some small puffs from the rapier, and here we get attacked by the Kraken. You can see I undocked it here, and everything just exploded and shook itself to pieces. And I tried this again and again and again. Thank you Quicksave for that, but it just didn't work. So in the end, what I had to do was use the orange tank as a sort of tug. So I maneuvered it to the front and undocked the whole thing as one piece, and that for some reason seemed to stop everything going wrong. So I'm not quite sure what was happening, but I'm glad I could find a fix for it. So we can close the bay modules again and do a quick beauty shot of the lights lighting up and deploying the solar panels. We will be deploying a larger set of solar panels in the final module, but we've got these little ones for now just to provide some power for what's up there so far, although there's no crew to support at the moment. And then we can burn once again to get our encounter with the Kerbal Space Center. Now, for the sake of keeping this at a sort of reasonable time length, I didn't show it in too much detail. What I had to do here was just pump a lot of the fuel from the posterior engines a lot further forward into the front tanks, namely the liquid fuel tanks. You can't really zoom too out of them because I'm doing this crazy roll to try and bleed off enough speed, because I was worried I was going to overshoot the Kerbal Space Center again, but it was all right in the end. As I was saying, I managed to pump in I pumped a lot of the fuel from the posterior tanks into the front tanks, namely the Mark 1 fuselages that flank the actual cargo bay itself, just to provide a bit of stability, because if there's too much fuel in the rear tanks, you end up being quite rear heavy, and it becomes very hard and unforgiving to steer. So I didn't do a fantastic job here. I ended up stopping almost halfway up the runway, but you saw how quick easily I was able to take off before, and again this module is a lot lighter than the last one, so I wasn't worried at all about not being able to get into orbit. So without further ado, we can just maneuver the car into position and drive it into the cargo bay, preparing ourselves for the third and final flight of this video. We could have gone on, like I say, we could have just built more trucks and more modules and continued going this on, but I didn't want this video to be going on too long, and KSP's frame rate when there are lots of vehicles within the physics range is pretty atrocious, so I didn't want to be playing at 5 FPS for the sake of being able to do more modules. So maybe I could do a follow-up series with this, perhaps even using a rocket like SpaceX would do rather than using an SSTO, but that's all for the future. This is really just something I wanted to do with a space plane and refuel it and everything, just so I could show off not only the space plane but also to show off the truck. This isn't actually the first video that truck has been shown in. I love I'm talking about it now whilst you can't even see it. Maybe I should just start talking about it when it's actually in shot. We can just park up the car for now, leave it in the car park, and get ready to open up the docking bays. There we go. So like I say, this isn't the first video that's used that truck. I did use the exact same craft file in Junior Attacks. I didn't actually show it doing its thing, but it was used to refuel one of the SSTOs that was used in the, I think it was the penultimate episode. The truck made a very brief appearance for the first sort of 20 seconds or so. Obviously the trailer for this one needs to be much bigger to fully fill this new SSTO, so the trailer in this video is different, but the truck itself is completely unchanged from Junior Attacks. So some of you may recognize it from that. A lot of people thought it was Hazardish's truck that I just used. It's not, it's different. There are quite a few big differences of it, but regardless, we can reverse ourselves slowly. If you choose to download the craft file for the truck, which I'm bundling with the SSTO, which you can get in the description as always, One thing, if you're struggling to get it to dock with the trailer, one thing I did build into the trailer was some aircraft wheels just at the front of the trailer. So the idea is you deploy them and it raises up the front just so you can more easily drive the truck underneath to dock it. I would also recommend having a engineer curve. Oh, we can just showing some of the fuel getting pumped, but again, I'm not going to show it in its entirety because it took a very, very, very long time to actually do it. Anyway, like I was saying, I would recommend having an engineer and at least one of the crew seats in the truck, just because the front wheels have a bit of a tendency to break, unfortunately. But luckily they can all be repaired from the cab itself. You do have to take the Kerbal out of the command seat, but then they can just walk around the cab in order to get close enough to the wheels to repair them. So, you know, that's just something I'd recommend, and we can park it up in the car park before preparing to set our encounter with the space station so far. So we can close off the docking port. We're kind of launching at the same kind of period as the other one. I left it a little bit later this time because I was so far ahead of my target last time, so I left it a little bit later this time. But the best way to learn how to do this is just through trial and error yourself, so you don't see too much of that. Anyway, pitching up fairly aggressively, not quite as steeply as last time because it just ended up being slightly easier to reach the magical 400 meters per second required for the Rapiers to fully engage in terms of their thrust. They don't thrust that much until they're going past about 410 meters per second, something like that. And then we can pitch up in close cycle mode and get our orbit finalized. So if we just raise up our wrap up, as you can see, already we're much closer, and then the target nodules appear. And we're pretty close. It's not perfect, but we are pretty close. So I'm not going to worry this time about setting a maneuver node that gets us nice and close, because we're fairly close anyway. We just need to circularize, because this time it's going to take about 600 meters per second to circularize, so we're not going to be able to get a very accurate maneuver node in terms of getting an encounter anyway. So I wasn't too worried about doing our encounter there, and then we can just wait our time. And I kind of skipped ahead of it because there was quite a lot of fine tuning and tweaking. I don't think it's the most engaging thing for you to watch, so I skipped through most of that. If you'd like to watch a tutorial about rendezvous, then there are other YouTubers who have already done that, so I don't really feel the need to explain it in detail, especially given the rather challenging nature of this video. I don't think this is the best thing to try and emulate if you're not that great at docking or rendezvous or anything like that. So there goes our final module. So we just have some nice crew capacity storage, some batteries, and a couple of command pods, one of them being the observatory. So we can just dock that on to the science lab module. I try and design my station so that the crew wouldn't ever be transferring through batteries or fuel tanks or anything like that, because it feels a little bit unrealistic. So as you can see, they would just be moving through docking ports between habitation modules. And then I thought it would be look a little bit cooler if the orange tank was coming off at this angle here. It doesn't really serve any additional purpose there, but you know, whatever. Actually, I think in hindsight, probably would have been more sensible to dock it to the station using the senior docking port, just because most ships that we dock into this will use the normal size docking port, but we can reconfigure it later if we want. And there's our obligatory beauty shop there. Then now we can just, I guess, we can leave it now. That's the station all built, so we can take this thing back to Kerbin for the final time, so we can fire up the engines for the final time and plan our encounter with the runway. Now, like I say, this mission is pretty ridiculous. It doesn't serve any real practical purpose, but it is very, very satisfying to pull off. Oh, there's a quick shot of me pumping the fuel forwards. Like I say, if you wanted to do this, I mean, it's a bit of a chore, and it's a bit of a pain in the neck to actually deal with the low frame rates on the runway at first. And it's far more sensible to just do it from the spaceplane angle, because your SSTO doesn't, you need to worry about loading cargo onto it. But this is just such a satisfying mission to pull. Once you do it, it gives you a pretty good sense of, you know, yeah, that's a thing I did. You can see I actually massively overshot the Kerbal Space Center this time, so I had to start flying back. We do have enough Delta V to get there. I mean, we have 7,000 meters per second of fuel. I was very liberal in my use of it though, because I decided that, you know what, I've landed at the Space Center quite a few times already. Let's land somewhere else. So we're going to land at the second runway. That's the one just over the sort of ocean that separates those little islands from the Kerbal Space Center itself. There's this airfield here. Thought it'd be nice to just land it here. But that's about it. That pretty much wraps this video up. So I guess we can do the nice cinematic zoom out effect, and then just have a look at the space station itself in orbit for, you know, properly this time. So there it is there. You can see our science modules there. We've also got our a little shot of the observatory there. Kerbal chilling in there, having a look at the view of nothing because he's not facing the planet. And there's the other two chilling in the lab there. But that pretty much wraps this video up, so I hope very much that you enjoyed it. On screen in a minute there's going to be some videos that take you to some other things I've built. Okay, so top left is a roving base I sent to Juna. Top right is the music video version of this video, which I was very proud of and highly recommend. And the bottom right is one specially selected by YouTube for you. And other than that, thank you for watching this one.
Die Mitschüler haben uns für verrückt erklärt, als wir das Patent tatsächlich angemeldet haben. Mit jedem Schritt haben wir immer weiter gemerkt, wie gut die Idee doch ist. Wenn man das Produkt eingebaut sieht, macht einen das wahnsinnig stolz.
Went for this solution instead. So squad, if you're listening, please fix. I mean, it could just be my incompetence at designing rovers. Let's face it, that's always a possibility when it comes to my issues I have with this game. So at this point in the mission, we really hit a low point. But don't worry, it's a literal low point, not a metaphorical one. God, that was awful. Because we're at the base of the canyon, which is the lowest point they're going to be reaching. We're then going to be rescaling the other side of the canyon and going to the other two biomes that I saw during our descent, so we can plant our flag, get our signs, and then be on our way. I'm kind of showing this in relatively abridged format, not only because I don't want this mission to go on too long, but also I was trying to be quite hasty at the time, because this is where I have it's not a confession, it's just a story that was really annoying at the time. And that is that I filmed this mission, I did the entire thing, I imported all the files into Sony Vegas on Sunday night ready to edit, and I noticed that all of the footage after the first touchdown in the Highlands at the very beginning of our Juna mission, you know, when we touched down in the Highlands, there was a stealth edit there, because what I did was when I looked at the footage, I realised that all the footage following that moment was corrupted, as in it either looked very, very blurry, pixelated and glitchy, or just a complete black screen and only audio recorded. I don't know why this happened. This is just sometimes Shadowplay does this to me. It just doesn't like me, I think. So I had to basically, at 11:30, and on Sunday night, on a school night no less, so before work, I had to basically redo the entire mission from this point here. So everything I actually did, I would try to be quite fast in order to get this done and be ready to have it done for next week, because most of my time spent during the week these days is working, but also I've got an exam on April the 18th, and a lot of my free time is spent revising for this exam. It's 2 exams. One of them is a disgusting 3-hour-long written paper, and the other one is a practical exam, which live patients come in. They're called OSCEs. They're horrible things. So that's kind of what I was doing there. But that's the story of why you may see it look like I was rushing as I was recording this. It's because I was getting impatient. But whatever. So here we are, just sort of getting back on the pod after chartering the Midland Sea biome, and hang on guys, I can just hear my fax machine going off. What's this? I've received some of the data from the labs and we can have a look at it now. This is terrible. Now we can use our atmospheric analysis experiments to learn more about this mysterious planet's skies. It's a cold and thin atmosphere that extends to 50 kilometers by the looks of things, 20 kilometers short of Kerbit. I'm trying to do this like in character, like I didn't know this before. Not only is it lower than Kerbit, it's also 1/15th the mass and surface pressure, and 1/9 the surface density. The sea level pressure on Juna, as in where the pressure is the highest, is the equivalent to being 15 kilometers above the surface on Kerbin, to give you a kind of idea of how they compare, with the pressure at the top of Juna's highest mountain being only 2.4 kilopascals. Now looking at these reports here, whilst the science messages that you're seeing on the in-game experiments, they don't really inform us of too much, these scientists back at Mission Control have just faxed me to inform me that the average molecular weight of the air that we got from the science experiments that we've been doing here is 42 grams per mole, and its adiabatic index is 1.20. While we don't know what elements comprise its atmosphere for sure, these elements would suggest that it's comprised mainly of carbon dioxide. So let's take a look at our temperature gauges as well. Our temperature gauges are telling us that the average datum level temperature of Juna, which is the, theoretically the best or the highest I should say, is around minus 23 degrees Celsius or minus 9.4 Fahrenheit for our American peers. This drops to minus 123 degrees Celsius. We ascend into the isothermal layer between 30 and 45 kilometers. And what's interesting is that Juno itself actually has no seasons due to the fact that it doesn't have an axial tilt. So this temperature doesn't really vary throughout the year. The poles at Juno can see temperatures as low as minus 90 degrees Celsius, and here we can see Bob enjoys a nice stroll through this freezing toxic wind as he plants the flag of the final biome we'll be visiting, and of course taking our surface sample as well. And then we can pretty much think about ascending from Juno. So first thing we can do is detach the parachutes to save a little bit of weight, and we're also going to activate those central fuel tanks as well, which were currently deactivated, so we'd be only draining fuel from the detachable auxiliary tanks, but we don't have enough fuel left in those for our actual Juno ascent, so we need all the tanks active for the actual climb. So what I did was I set the fuel priority of the central tanks to be slightly higher than the fuel priority for the peripheral tanks. What that means is that the engine will drain the side tanks first without touching the fuel contacts of the central ones, and then once the side tanks are emptied, it will then start feeding from the central tank, and obviously we can detach the auxiliary ones at that point. And in case you're wondering how I've been able to do this, I've set the decouplers there to have crossfeed enabled so that fuel can be transferred between the two stages, or kind of two parts of the craft. And well, that's how you do asparagus staging, things like that. Well, this isn't asparagus staging, this is technically called onion staging, but that's how you can do that kind of selective fuel tank, fuel pumping staging without the use of the fuel lines. But there we are, we have a beautiful apoapsis height just above the Kármán line, or the atmospheric line, so we can do a burn at apoapsis to increase our horizontal speed and get ourselves circularized. And as you can see from our total delta V, it was very, very tight in terms of budget. As I said before, this is the second time I did this mission. The first time I did it, I actually had a lot more fuel left over, so I obviously didn't do a very good job for this ascent just here, but it was enough. All we needed to do was get into orbit. We can do the actual docking procedure using the mothership with Jebediah at the helm, and we can dock with our lander and get ourselves on a course for Ike. We don't need the landing legs or the side tanks for Ike because it's much, much lower gravity, so we don't really need the landing legs or the extra fuel to land on it. And it saves a bit of weight. And obviously we don't require the parachute modules because Ike has no atmosphere. Okie dokie, so I haven't really talked too much about the docking procedure because this video really isn't here to serve as a docking tutorial. I highly recommend Scott Manley's docking tutorial if you want to get better at rendezvous, or check out my own docking tutorial in which I basically show you how to do an Apollo style Minmus mission. It's kind of done in a similar way. You just create a maneuver node with a mothership and play around with retrograde, prograde, radial in, radial out, normal and anti-normal until you can kind of force your target nodes to be closer and closer together. If you can't get it that close, don't worry, I wasn't that close either, to be fair. You just kind of get as close as you can, burn retrograde relative to the target on the nav ball, and then just burn towards the target, and just rinse and repeat, kind of burn towards the target, get close, burn retrograde, kill your speed relative to the target, then burn towards it again, so on, so on, so on, until you get nice and close. Now, as you can see, I don't have any monopropellant on board either the lander or the mothership, and that's because it's really easy to dock without monopropellant. I'm going to show you how. So make sure both objects are going 0 meters per second relative to each other on the nav ball, then have one of them target the docking port of the other, switch to the other vessel and do the same thing, so target the docking port of the one you want to dock with, and then what you do, you just hit point at target on the nav ball autopilot thing, and even when you're controlling one ship, the other one will naturally continue to face your target even if you're not directly controlling it. So it's just super easy. So as you drift together, both ships will continually fix their alignment, so you just dock with the docking ports nicely. It might not have been particularly easy to appreciate this because I was quite close to begin with and I was already kind of pointing in the kind of right direction, but I believe for the docking of the Ike section of this mission, it was a little bit rougher because it was getting later and later on in the evening. I really needed to get it done so I could go to bed. So I was a little bit rougher with that docking, so you can probably get a better sense of kind of the effectiveness of this strategy later on. But people have noticed my ships doing this in the past. We're like, why is his other ship still kind of steering itself to enable better docking? That's how. You just use the autopilot of the nav ball. It's not a mod. I think you'll have to have some upgrades if you're playing career mode, but in science and sandbox mode, which are the only two modes I've played, to be honest, you can do it from the get-go. Unless, of course, it's a probe and you've got no connection to the Kerbal Space Center. Other than that, you pretty much are good. And now we are Ike bound, and let's talk about Ike. You may or may not have noticed just how massive Ike is. It's smaller than the Mun, but it's bigger than Minmus. It's somewhere between the Mun and Minmus in terms of size. The closest thing in the solar system to Ike size is probably Dres. That's just ever so slightly bigger. But the thing is, with Ike, I'm comparing its size to Juno, and when you compare its size to Juno, it's the biggest planetary satellite relative to the size of its parent. This is in contrast to Phobos and Deimos, which are the satellites of Mars in the real world. You know, because although Juno is meant to be the in-game analog for Mars in KSP, Ike doesn't seem, like I say, it's not very similar to Phobos or Deimos at all, which are much, much smaller when compared to Mars's size. I mean, in the real solar system, it's the moon of Earth that's very, very large compared to its parent. But really, in the real solar system, no moon has a mass as similar to its parent body as Ike. So, little interesting tidbit about that. Another thing that's interesting about Ike is the fact that it's tidally locked to Juno, which means that only one side of Ike ever faces Juno. It's a bit like how Leith is tidally locked to Jool, which someone on the subreddit actually pointed out that if a civilization lived on Leith, they could theoretically never know about Jool if they never sailed to the other side of the planet, which is kind of a cool thing to think about. But to Ike's the same. It's also incredibly easy to get an encounter with Ike, as you may have seen me getting one earlier, because Ike has a massive sphere of influence, because, like I say, it's a very large body, and it's very, very close to Juno, so it doesn't take very much at all to get an Ike encounter. It's also very, very close to being in a geostationary orbit around Juno, as in, like, an orbit where your orbital speed is the same as the planet's rotation. So